Welcome to Javel Stories. Before we continue with the story, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell to always get notified for upcoming stories, and also share the story with loved ones and friends. Thank you very much. A long time ago, near the beautiful Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico, there lived a kind and lovely young woman named Tita Gomez. Tita's home was a small, cozy house nestled at the edge of the mountains. It wasn't a grand place, but it was filled with love and happiness. Every morning, Tita would step outside and admire the golden sun rising over the mountains. She would take a deep breath, feeling lucky to live in such a beautiful place. Tita was known in her village for her cheerful smile and her kind heart. She loved helping others, whether it was by baking bread for her neighbors or offering a listening ear when someone was sad. Everyone admired her, but one young man admired her more than anyone else. He was a handsome and brave villager with dark hair and warm brown eyes. The two of them often crossed paths at the village market, and each time they exchanged shy smiles. One day, the young man gathered his courage and approached Tita. "Your smile is brighter than the sun," he said, his voice trembling. Tita blushed but couldn't help smiling back. From that moment, their love story began. They spent their days walking through the village, laughing under the shade of the trees, and dreaming of a future together. Soon, they decided to get married. The whole village celebrated their union with music, dancing, and feasting. Tita and her husband, whose name was Luis, began their new life together in their little house by the mountains. They were so happy that it felt as though the world around them had grown brighter. One day, Tita felt a new kind of joy. She realized she was going to have a baby. She couldn't wait to tell Luis the wonderful news. When she did, his eyes sparkled with excitement. "We're going to be a family," he said, hugging her tightly. They spent their days preparing for the baby, dreaming of all the happy moments they would share as parents. For a while, everything was perfect. Tita's days were filled with laughter and love, and her heart was full of hope. She often sat by the window, sewing tiny clothes for the baby and humming cheerful songs. She imagined her child running through the fields, picking wildflowers and playing under the warm sun. But life wasn't always easy in those days. Far away, trouble was brewing. A war was starting, and people whispered about soldiers fighting to free Mexico from Spanish rule. Luis listened to the news with a worried expression. One morning, he sat down with Tita and said, "I have to go, my love. I must help fight for our country." Tita's heart sank, but she knew how brave Luis was. She hugged him tightly and said, "Come back to us. We'll be waiting." Luis promised he would return before the baby was born. With tears in her eyes, Tita waved goodbye as he disappeared down the road. She whispered to herself, "We'll wait no matter how long it takes." And so, Tita began her long, lonely wait. Tita sat by the window of her little house, her hands resting on her round belly. She watched the road where Luis had disappeared, hoping every day to see him return. The days passed slowly, and the whispers of war grew louder. Men from nearby villages were leaving to join the fight for Mexico's freedom. Women, children, and the elderly stayed behind, waiting, worrying, and praying for their loved ones. Tita tried her best to keep busy. She cleaned the house, worked in the garden, and prepared for the arrival of the baby. But it wasn't the same without Luis. Every time she heard footsteps outside, her heart leapt, thinking it might be him. But it was always just a neighbor passing by or a child running through the village. At night, when the house was quiet, Tita would sit by the window, looking up at the stars. "Please keep him safe," she whispered to the sky. The village changed as the war dragged on. Once lively and full of laughter, it now seemed quiet and heavy with worry. Many families were struggling, and food became harder to find. Some of the men who had left to fight never returned, and their families mourned them with heavy hearts. As the weeks turned into months, Tita's belly grew bigger, and soon it was almost time for the baby to be born. She wished more than anything that Luis could be there with her, but she knew he was fighting for something important. "He's a hero," she told herself, trying to stay strong. One cold evening, Tita felt the first signs that the baby was coming. She called for the village midwife, a kind old woman who had delivered many babies. The midwife held Tita's hand and helped her through the long night. When the sun rose, the cries of a newborn baby filled the house. Tita looked down at her son, his tiny face so peaceful and perfect. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You'll meet your papa soon," she whispered to him. She named him José, a name that Luis had always liked. José had dark hair like his father and big, curious eyes. Tita loved him more than anything. Even though she missed Luis terribly, José brought light into her days. She sang to him, rocked him to sleep, and told him stories about his brave father. "One day he'll come back to us," she promised. But as José grew, the war dragged on. Luis didn't return, and the letters stopped coming. Tita began to feel the weight of loneliness. She worked hard to care for her son. But life wasn't easy. Money was scarce, and sometimes there wasn't enough food. Still, she held on a hope. Every day, Tita sat by the window with José on her lap, watching the road. "He'll come back," she told her son. "We just have to wait a little longer." But deep down, she wondered how much longer she could wait. Life with José brought both joy and challenges. As he grew, his laughter filled the small house, making it feel less empty. He had a bright, curious spirit and loved exploring the fields and hills near their home. Tita often marveled at how much he resembled Luis, with his warm smile and the same twinkle in his eyes. But raising a child alone wasn't easy. Tita worked tirelessly to provide for José. She grew vegetables in their garden, sewed clothes for neighbors in exchange for food, and walked long distances to fetch water from the river. She often went without meals so that José could eat. Despite the struggles, she never let her son see her sadness. For him, she always wore a brave face. José adored his mother and often tried to help. "I'll carry the water, Mama," he'd say, though the bucket was almost as big as he was. His cheerful energy gave Tita the strength to keep going, even on the hardest days. Together, they made the best of what they had. At night, Tita would tell José stories about his father. "He's a hero," she said. "He's out there fighting to make our country free." José listened with wide eyes, imagining his father as a brave soldier leading his comrades to victory. "Do you think he'll come home soon, Mama?" he asked. "Yes, my son," Tita replied, though her heart ached with doubt. "He'll come home to us. I promise." As José grew older, he became the light of the village. Everyone admired his kindness and cleverness. He often helped the older villagers carry firewood or fetch water, and they would pat his head, saying, "You're just like your father." But as José thrived, Tita began to struggle more. The weight of loneliness pressed down on her, especially at night when the house was quiet. She missed Luis with every part of her heart. She longed to feel his arms around her and hear his reassuring voice. Sometimes she would sit by the window, staring at the road, and tears would fall silently down her cheeks. One day, José found her crying. "Don't be sad, Mama," he said, wrapping his small arms around her. "Papa will come back. I know he will." Tita hugged him tightly, her heart breaking. "You're right, my love," she said, forcing a smile. "He'll come back. We just have to keep waiting." But as the years passed, the waiting became harder. And slowly, without realizing it, Tita's hope began to fade. The years passed, and José grew from a bright-eyed toddler into a spirited young boy. He was strong, smart, and full of curiosity, just like his father. Tita loved watching him run through the fields and climb the small hills near their home, but each passing day reminded her of the promise Luis had made to return before José was born. That promise now felt like a faint echo of a happier time. By the time José turned 5, villagers began murmuring behind Tita's back. "It's been years. He's not coming back," one woman whispered to her friend at the market. "He must have died in the war," another added. Tita tried to ignore them, but their words lingered in her mind, fueling her growing fears. What if Luis really was gone forever? What if he had forgotten about them? To keep herself from despair, Tita poured her energy into caring for José. She worked harder than ever, taking on extra sewing jobs and tending her garden to make sure her son always had enough to eat. When José asked about his father, Tita spoke with forced optimism. "He's fighting hard, my son," she'd say. "He'll come home as soon as he can." But in the quiet moments, when José was asleep and the house was still, Tita allowed herself to feel the weight of her loneliness. She would sit by the window, staring at the moonlit road, and cry softly. Sometimes she whispered into the darkness, as if Luis might hear her. "Where are you, my love? Do you even know we're waiting for you?" As José grew older, he began to notice the sadness in his mother's eyes. "Mama," he said one evening, "do you think Papa remembers us?" Tita forced a smile. "Of course he does, my sweet boy. How could he ever forget us?" José nodded, but deep down, Tita wasn't so sure anymore. When José turned 10, he began attending school in the village. He loved learning and often came home bursting with excitement to share what he had discovered. "Mama, did you know that the Sierra Madre mountains were named after Mother?" he asked one day. "It's like they're protecting us, just like you protect me." Tita smiled, touched by her son's words, but even his cheerful stories couldn't fill the growing emptiness in her heart. She had spent nearly a decade waiting for Luis, and her hope was wearing thin. Every day, she stared at José's face and saw the man she loved, the man she missed, reflected in her son's features. It was both a comfort and a reminder of her loss. One night, as José slept soundly in his little bed, Tita sat by the window once again. The road stretched out before her, empty and silent. "How much longer must we wait?" she whispered to the darkness. But no answer came, only the rustle of the wind through the trees. And so, Tita continued to wait, though her heart grew heavier with each passing day. The whispers in the village grew louder with time. People spoke openly now, wondering why Tita still clung to the hope of Luis's return. "She's fooling herself," some said. "The war ended years ago. If he was alive, he'd be here." Tita heard their words but refused to believe them. "They don't understand," she told herself. "Luis is a good man. He wouldn't abandon us." But as the years dragged on, her faith began to waver. She had sacrificed so much for the dream of their family, endured hunger, loneliness, and hardship, but Luis still hadn't come back. The once hopeful thoughts that filled her mind began to twist into darker ones. She started to wonder if Luis had chosen to stay away. Maybe he had found someone else, another family. Maybe he had decided they weren't worth coming back for. The bitterness took root in her heart like a thorny vine, growing stronger with every day that passed without word from him. At night, as José slept peacefully, Tita sat by the window, consumed by her thoughts. Her mind played cruel tricks on her, making her think she saw Luis standing in the shadows outside or heard his voice calling her name. She would rush to the door, only to find nothing but the cold night air. Her paranoia grew. Feeding on her loneliness, she began to suspect that Luis was hiding somewhere nearby, watching her, laughing at her pain. She imagined him with another woman, living happily while she and José struggled to survive. These thoughts tormented her, turning her love for him into anger and resentment. José, now 11, noticed the change in his mother. She no longer laughed as easily or sang the cheerful songs he loved. Instead, she seemed distant, her eyes clouded with sadness. "Mama, are you okay?" he asked one evening. Tita forced a smile. "I'm fine, my love," she said. "Don't worry about me." But José couldn't help worrying. He tried to cheer her up by sharing stories from school or bringing her wildflowers he picked on his way home. "Look, Mama, aren't they pretty?" he said, holding out a handful of yellow blossoms. Tita took the flowers and kissed his forehead. "Thank you, my sweet boy," she said, her voice trembling. "You're such a good son." Despite José's efforts, Tita's despair deepened. Her once bright world had grown dark, and the shadows in her mind threatened to consume her. She didn't realize that the love and light she had left her son were slipping further out of her reach. And as her heart grew heavier, the stage was set for the tragedy that would soon unfold. It was a cold, quiet evening when the first crack appeared in Tita's fragile world. The sun had set hours ago, and the little house near the Sierra Madre mountains was lit only by the soft glow of a single candle. José was sitting at the small wooden table working on his school lessons, while Tita stirred a thin pot of soup over the fire. The room was silent except for the gentle scratch of José's pencil, and the bubbling of the pot. But in Tita's mind there was no peace. Her thoughts swirled like a storm, growing darker with each passing moment. She couldn't stop thinking about Luis's face's smile and the promise he had made. The promise he had broken. Why hadn't he come back? What had she done to deserve this endless waiting? Her heart was a battlefield of love and anger, hope and despair. As she stood by the fire, a strange noise outside the house made her jump. It was faint like the sound of footsteps on the dirt path. Her heart pounded. Was it him? After all these years, had Luis finally come back? She grabbed the candle and rushed to the door, flinging it open. But there was no one there, only the wind rustling through the trees. Disappointed and embarrassed, Tita closed the door and leaned against it. Her hands were trembling. She set the candle back on the table and glanced at José, who was watching her with a curious expression. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked. Tita nodded quickly. Yes, I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered. She returned to the fire, but the feeling of unease lingered. She couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was watching her. Over the next few weeks, the strange noises became more frequent. Sometimes she heard whispers outside her window. Other times, she thought she saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the garden. Each time, she rushed outside to look, but there was never anyone there. The constant fear and confusion began to wear on her, making her jumpy and irritable. José noticed the change in his mother. She seemed distracted and restless, often staring out the window for hours at a time. She barely spoke to him anymore, and when she did, her voice was sharp and impatient. He tried to cheer her up, but nothing seemed to help. One evening, as José returned from school, he called out cheerfully, "Mama, I'm home." But when Tita heard his voice, something in her mind snapped. She turned toward him, her eyes wide and wild. For a moment, she didn't see her son. She saw Luis, her husband, the man who had left her to suffer alone. The anger that had been building inside her for years boiled over, consuming her completely. José, confused by the look on her face, took a step back. "Mama, what's wrong?" Tita didn't answer. Her hands trembled as she stared at him, her mind filling with bitter thoughts. After all these years of pain and waiting, was this finally her chance to confront him? In that moment, the thin line between love and madness began to crumble, and Tita's world would never be the same. José stood in the doorway, clutching his school books to his chest. His mother was staring at him with an expression he didn't recognize. Her eyes were full of anger and hurt, but there was something else, something darker. He took a cautious step forward. "Mama, it's me. What's wrong?" But Tita didn't hear her son's voice. In her mind, she heard Luis, the man she had loved and waited for, now standing before her, mocking her pain. Her breathing grew rapid and her hands clenched into fists. "You dare come back after all these years?" she hissed. "After everything you've done?" José blinked, confused. "Mama, what are you talking about?" "It's me, José. Don't lie to me." Tita screamed, her voice trembling with fury. "You left me to suffer. You left us to starve. And now you think you can just walk back into my life like nothing happened?" José dropped his school books and took another step forward, his eyes wide with fear. "Mama, I don't understand. It's me, your son." But Tita couldn't see the truth. Her vision blurred with tears, and the weight of years of heartbreak and loneliness clouded her mind. She grabbed the kitchen knife from the table, her hands shaking. "You betrayed me," she whispered. "You betrayed us." "Mama, please," José cried, backing away. "It's me. I'm your son." But it was too late. The anger and madness that had consumed Tita for so long erupted like a volcano. With a scream, she lunged forward, the knife glinting in the candlelight. The house filled with the sound of José's terrified cries and Tita's ragged breathing. The small home that had once been a place of love and laughter was now a scene of unimaginable horror. When it was over, José lay still on the floor, his wide eyes staring up at the ceiling. Tita stood over him, the knife slipping from her hands. She stared at her son's lifeless body, the truth slowly dawning on her. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands covering her face. "Madre de Dios," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What have I done?" The room was silent except for the sound of her sobs. Tita reached out and touched José's face, her tears falling onto his pale skin. "You're not Luis," she whispered. "You're my son, my beautiful boy." The weight of her actions crushed her, and she cried out in despair, her wails echoing through the small house. But no amount of tears could undo what had been done, and in the dark stillness of the night, Tita's heart shattered into a million pieces. The house was eerily quiet as Tita sat on the floor beside José's lifeless body. The knife lay forgotten at her side, its blade smeared with blood. Her trembling hands reached out to her son's face, brushing his hair away from his forehead. His eyes, which had once sparkled with life and curiosity, stared blankly at the ceiling. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "My boy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My sweet José. I didn't mean to. I thought." Her words trailed off, lost in her sobs. She cradled his small, lifeless body in her arms, rocking back and forth, as though she could comfort him even now. But it was no use. The warm, lively boy who had once filled her days with joy was gone. Tita's thoughts swirled in chaos. How could this have happened? How could she have let her anger and madness drive her to harm the one person who had never abandoned her? José had been her light, her reason to keep going. And now, through her own actions, that light had been extinguished. As the hours passed, Tita knew she couldn't stay like this forever. The villagers would come soon, and if they found out what she had done, they would turn on her. She needed to hide what had happened, though she wasn't sure how. Her mind, still clouded with grief and guilt, latched onto a desperate plan. With shaking hands, she wrapped José's body in a cloth. She wiped her face, trying to steady herself, and lifted him in her arms. He felt so small, so fragile, as though he might slip away from her entirely if she wasn't careful. She stepped outside into the cool night air, her steps unsteady but determined. Behind the house, the ground was rocky and hard, but Tita began to dig. Her fingers clawed at the earth, her nails breaking as she worked. The soil was rough, cutting into her skin, but she didn't stop. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered apologies over and over. "I'm so sorry, my son. I'm so sorry." She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice her neighbor watching from shadows. The woman, who had come to borrow some salt, froze in horror at the sight of Tita, her hands and face smeared with blood, clutching a bundle tightly to her chest. Realizing something terrible had happened, the neighbor backed away, quietly before turning and running toward the village. As Tita continued to dig, the neighbor burst into the village square, shouting, "Tita Gomez! She's killed her son! She's burying him behind her house!" The villagers, alarmed by the woman's cries, grabbed lanterns and followed her. The news spread quickly, and soon a crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. They marched toward Tita's house, their voices rising as they called out her name. Tita heard the shouts and froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked toward the approaching lights. She realized with a sinking feeling that it was too late. They had found out. There was no hiding her crime now. The villagers surrounded her, their faces lit by the flickering glow of lanterns. "What have you done?" one man demanded. "Is it true? Did you kill your own son?" Tita stood, trembling, her hands smeared with blood. "It was an accident," she tried to explain, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I thought he was—" But her words were drowned out by the rising anger of the crowd. "Murderer!" someone shouted. "How could you do this to your own child?" The crowd's anger grew, their voices echoing through the night. Tita backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The villagers were closing in, their shouts growing louder. Tita clutched her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I'm innocent," she cried desperately. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The crowd, blinded by their anger and grief, began picking up stones, and Tita knew her fate was sealed. The first stone struck Tita's shoulder, making her stumble. She cried out in pain, But the villagers didn't stop. Another stone hit her leg, then her arm, each one sending sharp jolts of pain through her body. The crowd shouted at her, their voices filled with rage and betrayal. "Murder!" they yelled. "You killed your own son!" Tita tried to shield herself, her arms raised in a futile attempt to block the stones. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling with fear. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking clearly." But the villagers were too angry to listen. To them, Tita was no longer the kind and loving woman they had known. She was a monster, someone who had committed the worst crime imaginable. Their grief and horror fueled their actions, and the stones kept coming. As the crowd grew more frenzied, Tita collapsed to the ground. Her body ached, bruises blooming across her skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish in her heart. She had lost everything: her son, her hope, her sanity. Now, even her life was slipping away. The last thing Tita saw before her vision blurred was the faces of the villagers, twisted with anger and grief. Her final thought was of José, her sweet boy, and the love they had shared. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then everything went dark. The crowd fell silent as Tita's broken body lay motionless on the ground. Some villagers, realizing what they had done, began to weep. Others stood in stunned silence, the weight of their actions sinking in. Slowly, a group of men stepped forward to carry Tita's lifeless body. "We can't leave her here," one of them said. "She doesn't belong in the village anymore." The men carried Tita's body to the top of the Sierra Madre mountains. There, in a shallow ravine, they dug a grave and placed her inside. They covered the grave with a heavy stone, hoping it would keep her restless spirit from rising. Back in the village, José was given a proper burial. His small coffin was adorned with flowers, and the villagers wept for the boy who had been taken too soon. They vowed to remember him, but the memory of that terrible night would haunt them forever. Little did they know, Tita's story was far from over. The next morning, the village awoke to an unsettling silence. The echoes of the previous night's violence still lingered in the air, and the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on everyone's hearts. The villagers avoided speaking of Tita, but her name hung unspoken in every conversation, every glance exchanged in the market or by the well. At the top of the Sierra Madre Mountains, Tita's grave lay still. The men who had carried her body there returned to the village, their faces pale and haunted. One of them had insisted on placing a large, flat stone over the grave, muttering, "She's not like the others now. We need to keep her there." The other men nodded grimly, though none dared say why they agreed. Something about the night had unsettled them, something in Tita's last cries, in the look in her eyes as she succumbed. They carried the weight of their actions, but deep down, they also carried fear. Back in the village, José was buried with care and sorrow. His small coffin was laid in the village cemetery, surrounded by flowers picked by children who had been his friends. The villagers prayed for his soul, their tears mingling with the soft rain that fell that day. José's grave became a place of mourning and reflection, reminder of innocence lost and the darkness that had consumed his family. For a time, the village was quiet. People avoided the little house by the mountains, now empty and eerily still. The windows seemed like hollow eyes, staring out at the world with sadness. No one dared go near it, and even the bravest children whispered that they heard cries coming from inside at night. Then the sightings began. The first to see her was a young shepherd boy. He had been leading his flock near the base of the mountains when he heard a sound, a faint, sorrowful wail carried on the wind. Curious but uneasy, the boy followed the sound. As he approached the ravine where Tita had been buried, the wailing grew louder. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding, when he saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, her long black hair streaming behind her like a shadow. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes wide and filled with anguish. She moved slowly, her arms outstretched as if searching for something or someone. The boy didn't wait to see more. He dropped his staff and ran as fast as he could back to the village, shouting about the ghost he had seen. At first, the villagers dismissed his story as a child's imagination. But soon, others began to report strange occurrences near the mountains. Travelers claimed to hear cries in the night, a woman's voice wailing for her son. Some said they saw her wandering the paths near the cemetery, her figure glowing faintly in the moonlight. Others spoke of stones moving on their own, flying through the air as if thrown by unseen hands. Fear began to spread through the village. The people whispered that Tita's spirit had not found peace. She's cursed, they said. She's searching for her son, and if she can't find him, she'll take someone else. The villagers decided to avoid the mountains at all costs. But as the legend grew, so did their fear, and soon they would take desperate measures to protect themselves from the wrath of Tita Gomez. The haunting of Tita Gomez became the most talked-about story in the village. Everyone had heard about the ghost who wandered the mountains and the cemetery, crying for her son. Some were skeptical, dismissing the stories as superstitions born from guilt and grief. But those who had seen her, truly seen her, knew better. One evening, a group of men gathered in the village square. They were the same men who had buried Tita's body, and their faces were lined with worry. "She's not resting," one of them said, his voice low. "Her spirit is angry." Another man nodded. "It's our fault. We didn't give her a proper burial. We let our anger guide us, and now she's taking it out on the living." The villagers debated what to do. Some suggested digging up her grave and moving her body to the cemetery, burying her next to her son. But others were too frightened to go near the ravine. "If we disturb her," they said, "it might make her angrier." In the end, they decided on a ritual. A local elder, known for her knowledge of old traditions, suggested that anyone passing by Tita's grave should leave an offering, a stone placed on the grave as a sign of respect. "If we show her that we remember her," the elder said, "maybe she will leave us in peace." The villagers began to follow this practice, and soon Tita's grave was covered in stones of all shapes and sizes. Travelers passing through the area were warned to do the same, lest they invoke the ghost's wrath. "Throw a stone on the grave," the villagers said, "or she'll throw one at you." Despite their efforts, the hauntings did not stop. Tita's ghost was still seen wandering the cemetery, her cries echoing through the night. Some said she was searching for her son, unable to accept that he was gone. Others believed she was punishing the living for the pain they had caused her. And so, the legend of Tita Gomez grew, spreading far beyond the village. Her story became a warning to all who heard it, a tale of love, madness, and the price of betrayal. The ritual of leaving a stone on Tita Gomez's grave became an unshakable tradition. Travelers passing through the Sierra Madre mountains heard the villagers' warnings, and more often than not obeyed. "It's just a simple thing," they told themselves. "A stone for a grave, no harm in it." But those who ignored the warnings paid a steep price. One story spread quickly among the villagers, a tale of a merchant who had laughed off the ritual. He had arrived at the village late one evening, his cart loaded with goods to sell. The villagers cautioned him about Tita's grave as he prepared to travel further into the mountains. "Throw a stone on her grave," they said, "or she'll come for you." The merchant scoffed, waving them off. "I don't believe in ghost stories," he said. "You villagers are just trying to scare me." Early the next morning, he set off on his journey without stopping at Tita's grave. That night, the villagers heard screams echoing down from the mountains. When a search party went to investigate, they found the merchant's cart overturned and his body lying nearby, bruised and battered. Stones surrounded him, as though they had rained down from heavens. "He didn't leave an offering," the villagers whispered. "She stoned him to death." The story sent chills through the community, cementing the legend of Tita's wrath. Even the bravest souls now refused to pass her grave without leaving a stone. Some left flowers or coins as well, hoping to appease her restless spirit. The haunting continued, though. Villagers still heard her cries on moonless nights, a wail of sorrow so chilling it froze their blood. Those who lived closest to the cemetery swore they saw her wandering between the gravestones, her figure glowing faintly in the darkness. She always seemed to be searching, her hands outstretched and her voice trembling with grief. "I want my son," she would moan, her words carried by the wind. "Where is my José?" Children in the village were especially terrified of the legend. They dared each other to walk near Tita's grave, though most never made it far before running back in fear. Those who claimed to have seen her described the same thing: a woman with long, wild hair and a face twisted with sadness. As the years went by, Tita's story became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a warning about the dangers of unchecked anger and despair. The villagers taught their children to honor their loved ones and to cherish the time they had together. But even as life moved on, the shadow of Tita Gomez lingered. Her grave remained at the top of the mountains, marked by an ever-growing pile of stones, and her ghost, it seemed, was destined to wander forever. Far from the village, at the edge of the cemetery, Tita's ghost drifted silently. Her feet barely touched the ground as she moved, her white dress fluttering in the breeze like a tattered shroud. Her cries pierced the night, mournful and full of regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over. "I didn't mean to hurt you, José. Please forgive me." But there was no answer, only the rustling of the trees and the distant howl of a coyote. Tita wandered between the gravestones, her eyes scanning the ground as if she might find her son hiding there. When she passed by José's grave, her wails grew louder. She reached out to touch the flowers left by the villagers, her ghostly fingers brushing the petals. "Why can't I find him?" she cried. "Why won't he come back to me?" Her sorrow was unbearable, even in death. Though she had lost her mind in her final days, Tita's love for her son had never wavered. Now, trapped between worlds, she was forced to relive her mistake over and over, her guilt chaining her to the earth. Sometimes, when the moon was full, travelers claimed to see her kneeling by José's grave. Her figure would glow faintly in the moonlight, her shoulders trembling as she sobbed. But when they approached, she would vanish, leaving only the faint sound of her voice on the wind. "I'm so sorry," she would whisper, her words fading like smoke. Despite her anguish, Tita's presence brought a strange comfort to some. Mothers who had lost children of their own would visit the cemetery and leave offerings at her son's grave. They believed that Tita's spirit watched over all the lost souls in the village, guiding them to rest. But for Tita, there could be no peace. Her love and her sorrow were too great. She remained tethered to the earth, wandering the mountains and the cemetery, searching endlessly for the son she had lost. Her cries became a warning for those who heard them, reminder of the dangers of despair, the power of a mother's love, and the heavy price of mistakes. And so, the legend of Tita Gomez continued to grow. As the years turned into decades, the story of Tita Gomez and her ghostly wanderings became part of the fabric of the village. It was told around campfires, whispered by children under the covers, and passed on to travelers who dared venture near the Sierra Madre mountains. The villagers viewed her story as both a warning and a lesson, a tale of love, grief, and the dangers of letting despair consume the soul. The grave at the top of the mountains became a place of fear and fascination. People spoke of it in hushed tones, referring to it only as La Tumba Maldita, the cursed grave. Those who had seen Tita's ghost swore she appeared most often when the moon was high, her cries blending with the howling wind. Her presence was undeniable, they said, and those who disrespected her grave faced terrible consequences. Travelers, skeptical of the stories, often learned the truth the hard way. One such traveler, a young man named Arturo, laughed when the villagers warned him about the grave. "It's just a pile of rocks," he said. "I have no time for ghost stories." Despite their pleas, Arturo set off into the mountains without stopping to place a stone on Tita's grave. As he ascended the rugged path, the air grew colder, and the wind seemed to whisper around him. He heard faint cries in the distance, but he dismissed them as tricks of his imagination. By the time he reached the top of the mountain, the sun had set and darkness surrounded him. He decided to camp for the night, lighting a small fire to keep warm. But as the fire crackled, he heard the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and growing closer. Arturo turned, his heart pounding, but saw no one. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman with long black hair and a flowing white dress. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted in a mournful expression. "Where's my son?" she whispered, her voice chilling and otherworldly. Terrified, Arturo tried to speak, but no words came. The woman raised her hands, and suddenly stones began to rain down around him. He scrambled to escape, but the stones followed him, pelting him with relentless force. He stumbled down the mountain, bruised and bloodied, vowing never to return. When Arturo arrived back in the village, he told everyone what had happened. His story spread, adding to the legend of Tita Gomez. Even the most skeptical travelers began to heed the villagers' warnings, placing stones on her grave before continuing their journeys. For the villagers, Tita's ghost became a part of life. They avoided the mountains at night, and whenever her cries were heard, they whispered prayers for her and her son. Though they feared her, they also pitied her. They understood that her anger and sorrow came from a place of deep love, a love so powerful it bound her to the world of the living. The villagers continued to tell her story, not only as a warning to travelers, but also as a reminder to cherish the people they loved. Tita's tale, they said, was a lesson about the dangers of losing oneself to grief, but it was also a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love. And so, the legend lived on, passed from one generation to the next. The ghost of Tita Gomez remained a haunting presence in the Sierra Madre mountains, her cries echoing through the night, a timeless reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded so many years ago. The years turned into centuries, but Tita's story never faded. Her grave at the top of the Sierra Madre Mountains became a landmark visited by those brave or foolish enough to seek it. The pile of stones on her grave grew higher, a testament to the fear and respect she commanded. The villagers continued to leave offerings for Tita, hoping to appease her restless spirit. Mothers, in particular, felt a connection to her sorrow. They brought flowers and small tokens to her grave, whispering prayers for her to find peace. Some said they felt her presence as they knelt by the grave, a cool breeze, a faint whisper, or the sensation of being watched. But no matter how many offerings were left, Tita's cries continued to echo through the mountains. On moonlit nights, travelers still reported seeing her ghost wandering the cemetery, her figure glowing faintly in the dark. Her lament for her son never ceased, her voice filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to pierce the very fabric of the night. One day, an old woman from the village decided to visit Tita's grave. She had heard the story as a child and had always been fascinated by it. Now, nearing the end of her life, she wanted to see the place where the legend began. She climbed the mountain slowly, her steps careful and deliberate, until she reached the grave. The old woman knelt beside the pile of stones and closed her eyes. "Tita Gomez," she said softly, "you've suffered enough. I pray that you and your son find each other, wherever you are." As she spoke, a strange feeling came over her. The wind grew still, and the air around her seemed to hum with a quiet energy. For a moment, the old woman thought she heard a voice, a faint, trembling whisper. "Thank you," it said. The villagers claimed that after that day, Tita's ghost was seen less often. Her cries grew softer, fading into the wind like a distant memory. Some say she finally found peace, her spirit reuniting with her son in the afterlife. Others believe she still lingers, watching over the village and protecting the lost souls who wander too far from home. Whatever the truth, the legend of Tita Gomez continues.